Well, the way that it came about was that I'd been seeking around for quite a while. My mother was a theosophist and my father was into astrology and Egyptology. And I was sort of in the direction. I'd heard about this dreadful Aleister Crowley and so on. At that time, when I was still in school in the 70s, books by Crowley and information on Crowley was nowhere near available like it is now, what with the World Wide Web and all the publications that have come out. For quite a while, I couldn't really find out anything very specific about him except the sort of gutter press kind of a thing. But I did start to embark on a study of mysticism and the occult in general and so on. Like, I might as well say I'm a real occult nut. Have always been a real enthusiast, fascinated by the whole thing, you know. And in the late 70s, when the first Thoth Tarot deck came out, it had an address in it. Prior to that, I'd sort of tried to make a few inquiries into the OTO. I'd asked here and I'd sort of tried to check out there. Apparently I couldn't find any group in New Zealand that was OTO or even interested in Crowley. There was still a lot of, spooky club stuff. Generally he didn't have a good reputation. People didn't view things quite like they do now. They had more of a 1950s kind of a attitude. But when the Thoth Tarot deck came out, it had in it an address in America to the OTO. So I wrote a letter to America, and when I got the response, I was blown away and thunderstruck to find that Hymenaeus Beta had a factorum, or maybe she was secretary, a local woman who had travelled to America and become a member of the OTO. So I set up communication with her, and we sort of came to the conclusion that if and when she came back to New Zealand and to Australasia, I was keen to get into it, and I had quite a bit of communication with her. She sent me a number of posters to put up, suggested I open a PO box, try to organise local interest. I was a bit young and skirty about all of this, being one person out there, jittery and all the rest, but I did definitely organise. I sent posters out to various bookshops around New Zealand and this sort of a thing. And I did get one or two responses, some of who turned out to be real gold at the time, or in the months and years that came ahead. And eventually Egeria came back to New Zealand, and it was then the first time that I met her. She initiated a number of people in Australia and New Zealand, and for a while indeed she lived here and then went to live more permanently in Australia. But by then I had moved from Hastings, where I was living in Hawke's Bay, up to Auckland, where a couple of other people who had answered the posters I'd arranged to have stuck up in local bookshops and so on. And it was agreed that yes, we'd form a solidarity and see if we could activate the OTO, seeing as how there didn't seem to be an OTO of any sort, way, shape or form in the place. The thing always has to be remembered, we were fairly young and inexperienced, hadn't done anything much, didn't know much. However, over the years, out of it, with much groaning and grinding, everything has turned into a totally different situation today, And that's how I essentially came into it. And the next major step that I guess that came in is, because if we wanted initiation and the only initiator was in Australia, it was necessary either to bring the initiator from Australia, this would be Egeria, over to New Zealand, or else to go to Australia. Several of my associates, who are all sort of 0th degree, 1st degree, But the big thing that was looked up to was to get to third degree. This was looked upon as a real big step back then. To be a third degree was high, right? Whereas nowadays, of course, we're looking at it in a slightly different way because the whole machine is more mobile, the whole war engine works more efficiently and people can click through more easily. Several of my associates moved to Australia, to Sydney, and I moved over there too, and we lived there in Sydney for a while.
Can I just step back for a second?
Yeah.
So what year was this when you were first initiated in Auckland?
Well, it was early 80s I'm talking about, the very early 80s, after Egeria first came over, and then it went on through the 80s and up into the 90s. Yeah. And people came and went, and one way or another it grumbled on. Now, as the people who have been doing it here try hard as we did to try and make the OTO work with radical in effect, actually, I mean, there wouldn't have been, you could count the people on one hand, right? But as these same people were the ones, all of us, who went over to live in Australia, while in Australia, a number of other people who had sort of been on the outskirts and interested, maybe they didn't like us, I don't know. But when we left, this whole group converged and became the Auckland OTO. Another man, another acquaintance of mine from New Zealand, Brother Nemo, acquired a charter to initiate, and he was living in Australia but travelled back to New Zealand and initiated these people in Auckland, and they were for several years essentially what made up the local OTO. It was young, sincere, and that's, you could not deny the fervency or the sincerity, young males mostly, and they held the flame, the oriflame high kind of thing. And when eventually myself and several of my acquaintances came back within a few years, we sort of retook over the order and it moved on. And then we had a sister by the name of Sister Osis who came along from England, and she stayed through thick and thin with the bit between her teeth, trying to deal with what, I mean, all deference to everybody, but it was essentially way back then a sort of a boys' club, it was young boys, really, young men, I should say, not boys, who had all kinds of funny ideas about what Thelema and the OTO and everything was, but were, as I said, really sincere, but we all did the best we could. As the years went by, the group fluctuated larger and smaller and eventually rose to a reasonably solid size where we could bring in initiators from America to move up through higher degrees past the third up into the order.
Sebasius and Helena coming in.
Exactly. They were the first two to come across. When we had been in Australia, a very, very fascinating and very capable person who called himself Shiva turned up. And he... this guy turned up. He wasn't a member, and I met him on several occasions. That, grim old soul that I am, I've seen so many people come and go, and I believe sincerity when I see it. I'd returned to New Zealand, and after that he was a diamond, a bright star, and ended up taking over the OTO in Sydney and made something rather more of a success. And it grew and manifested a lot of very, very interesting stuff, publications, membership and so on. And the New Zealand OTO went on as it has done ever since.
So, are you still, at what point did you depart from Theosophy, if you ever did?
I think I stayed a member 1 year. I was young, I can't remember exactly what age. I think I was 19 or 20. And I joined it, one, because my mother was in it, two, because I was heavily influenced by some of the stuff that came out of the Theosophical Society, and three, because we had been living in Tauranga and there was a Theosophical lodge there, and so it gave me access to people who had at least similar interests. But I stayed in Theosophy. I only think I signed up once and stayed for 1 year. Yeah. My father and mother decided that they were going to move to Hawke's Bay, to Havelock North. And I'd read a book by somebody called Eric Howie called The Magicians of the Golden Dawn, and I'd read this book, and it had mentioned that there had been this man called Falcon, Dr. Falcon, who in 1912 had sort of come over to New Zealand and set up a Golden Dawn style of organisation. As soon as I heard this, I pricked my ears up. I was in Tauranga, and actually back in those days, I had quite a good job. But then as soon as I became aware of this, I went weak on all that and decided, oh, well, if Mum and Dad are going to live down in Havelock North, I'll go down too, because I want to look up on this thing. I didn't honestly believe that the organisation would still be in existence. I really didn't think that there would be some style of Golden Dawn down there connected with Havelock North. But I went down there, and my mother was still strongly connected to the Theosophical Society and met a number of people, and we met an old lady. And she let something slip. And I heard about it from my mother, who said, oh, you know, so-and-so was saying that. And I said, oh, yes, ask her if it's called the... And it was turned, and the old lady was flabbergasted that anybody knew the name, because it was under oath and seal and sworn oaths of occult violence to anyone who broke the oaths, and how could he possibly have known that? You know, I of course read it in Eric Howie's book, you know. And so I organised to meet her, and through her I met other people who were actually in it, and it was still an operative, moving organisation with the temple and all the rest. Yeah, it wasn't as big as it had been some years earlier, when at one stage it was really quite large. But it was still, and it was made up of authentic, sincere people, and they did all the grades and so on, up through the Stella Machutna. Oops, no, I'm not breaking oaths. It's all now, you know, it's not oath-breaking material. However, at a later date, I decided to depart for to Australia to live. And when I returned, I only lived there 2 years, and I came back flabbergasted and spewed when I found that in the 2 years that I'd been away, they'd closed it down.
What a shame.
Yeah, they closed it down. But that was all right, because by that stage I had, in myself, decided that I wanted to go down the path of Thelema. And so then I moved to Auckland.
Can you just explain what the Wharewa temple was like?
Been there a long time, 1912 onwards. Oldish people generally, most of them been in it for years, ever since they were young, taciturn, reticent, didn't like anything to do with published materials of the Golden Dawn. They'd just about spew if they thought you had a copy of Israel Regardo's Golden Dawn or something. You had to go. They had the whole machine in place, all the steps through the grades and so on. Falcon had built a house in Havelock North that had a large basement. And indeed, I think the house was probably designed around the idea of building the basement underneath it. The house in later years gained something of a reputation in the uninitiated, you know. They didn't know what funny stuff was supposed to go on there.
So talk to me a little bit about Thelema and what's excited you about that.
I think the first thing that got me going was a boyish fascination with Aleister Crowley. You know, as I had said earlier, there wasn't much available. My mother didn't like him. My mother, who was a theosophist and had been since the end of World War II or something, thought that he was a horrible person and, he was the baddie and so for whatever reason. But I was interested. I wanted to know more about this guy. And then things began to come out from the late 60s, early 70s, sort of. He became more well-known, like, the usual cliched example is he ended up on one of the covers of a Beatles record, and various sort of British hedonists and band members and so on professed an interest in Crowley. All of this at that time, like the early 70s, were real heady. And along with it came more free availability to materials by Aleister Crowley. I tried to buy books by him, like, Magic and Theory and Practice, the Book of the Law and things like this. There was only one occult bookshop really active in New Zealand that I had access to. This was in Hastings. It was called Stationers' Hall, and it advertised in local newspapers, occult books, and you could write to them and they'd send you a catalogue. And I used to write to this gentleman and tried to get Crowley books. Then suddenly it all clicked open. They began to get published. Level Press and other organisations, American publishers, began to publish Crowley books again, and suddenly it became available. Sphere Books brought out, I walked into a bookshop and I couldn't believe it. Here was a paperback of Moonchild, I couldn't believe it. I was blown away. And then Kenneth Grant published Magic and essentially book 4, parts 1, 2 and 3, and so on. This was an expensive book from Rutledge Keegan Paul at the time, but I dutifully ordered it and got a copy, and from then on things started to become available, and that's from then I began to more closely be able to align and focus what indeed Aleister Crowley really did mean and say and think, as opposed to the rubbish. By rubbish, I mean that sort of spooky club stuff, that sort of thing you still read to this very day. But once his books actually began to become available, at the same time a lot of other materials started to come onto the market regarding the Golden Dawn and the Western esoteric tradition, Eastern mysticism, during that sort of during the hippie sort of period, as it moved through the sort of the new agey movement, a lot of material became available.
So Thelema for me.
Well, putting aside all the cliched stuff, it's just as far as I see it, you've just essentially got to be what you truly are. What is your true self? You don't want to live up to society's standards or somebody else's, even though you will help other people and society. But essentially, to my understanding of it, it tends to be individualistic. A person, it's a mode of self-initiation, as far as I perceive it, putting aside initiatory groups and so on. Ultimately, it's the journey inwards, as Crowley said. And a person is self-initiating and has to art form their own way through it. What's true and right for one person in one place and time isn't true or right for somebody else in another place and time necessarily. And it's that individualistic, creative aspect of it that, to me, is a basic fundamental of Thelema.